we feel like we are physically separated, but it's actually a pretty intimate conversation that we're having right here.
Virtual meetings and events definitely are not new, but they definitely became more prevalent due to COVID-19 pandemic and people pretty much being forced to work from home. Now there seems to be a bit of a burnout due to that. Why do you think that burnout has occurred?
So at first, a lot of it was blamed on what was called Zoom fatigue, but I mean, really, that was just video call platform fatigue, period. But what I always say is it's not the platform's fault, it's actually operator error. Because what happened during the pandemic is there was this meeting explosion. We had more meetings than ever before, and they lasted longer than ever before with no recovery time in between. So you would be in back to back to back to back meetings all day, which is exhausting in any situation, regardless of the format that you're meeting in, virtual or otherwise. So that was a big contributor to the burnout that we were all facing. And even though many of us lost our commute, how do we fill in that time that we got back? With more work. So actually we had more meetings that we snuck in there as well. So I think that is a big part of the problem with, virtual call fatigue, virtual fatigue.
I think it's for sure safe to say that virtual is here to stay. There are a lot of people, like you mentioned, that don't need the commute anymore because they can work from home, and people are even leaving jobs that are kind of like forcing them back into the office. So I think that we're definitely going to see more of like a hybrid model stick. But I know that some people still feel like virtual, kind of sucks. Like they don't have that overall like interaction or engagement that you get like in person. So based on your experiences, why do you think people are hesitant to host things virtually?
Well, I think that there is this very common perception that holding things virtually doesn't result in them being engaging, but we're finding so many innovative tools that make engagement possible, and in some ways even deeper than if you were meeting in person. So for example, it's odd in this environment on Zoom, for example, that we feel like we are physically separated, but it's actually a pretty intimate conversation that we're having right here. So you can actually create these pretty tight bonds and build relationships this way, but it just takes a rethinking of what that means to foster the relationship. So one of the things that people do miss is what we would call social lubrication, where you don't have the opportunity to kind of chit chat as you're walking down the hall and going into the conference room with your colleague. You don't have the moments of spontaneity when you bump into each other in the break room. And that does help to build team cohesion and those ties. But what it requires you to do in a virtual setting is just be more intentional about it, and not forget that you have to have humanity in your meetings. So leave some time where you're fostering the relationships. It's beyond just icebreakers. It's just giving moments where you can just be real with each other and share what's going on in your lives outside of your specific role.
One of the things at Philo that we see people, they often want to replicate those different ad hoc meetings and things like that. So, do you have any best practices or tips that you may have picked up that kind of helps people replicate those instances?
Well, if you have a set, hourly schedule for each worker, whenever that they're going to be at their desk, you can actually have the same sort of virtual experience as you would in person, because oh, they're online. These are their times when they're going to be available, and you can actually just ping them through whatever platform that you're using, and that works actually really, really well. And maybe just like in person situations, they might say, no, I'm not available. I'm actually working on something else. Let's meet a little bit later. But you still have the opportunity to kind of, ping people and hop into a quick call just to either catch up or to follow up on some action item that you have. So it is possible to replicate those things. The other thing that I would say is if you're holding a virtual event, there are some really innovative ways that platforms create those networking opportunities, but the biggest barrier to their usage is people don't know how to use them. So if you're planning a virtual event and you are using the virtual kiosks where you can hop in and meet with with somebody, remotely, if you're, for example, if you're hybrid and you're attending in person, just give people some basic skill up on how to use the tool, and then it's more likely to be used. But just assuming that, saying, hey, we have this really cool tool where you can actually, connect with individuals who are meeting, and that's going to be enough to get them to use it. That's not going to be the case. You need to actually do a quick primer on how to use the technology to empower them to actually, adopt it.
We at Philo have seen where, like lower level, for lack of better words, employees are ready to embrace like these new tools and things like that. But their leadership or execs are the ones that are like leaning more towards like, oh, virtual is just too much. I'm kind of like, I really want to see you guys in person. I don't want to invest in another virtual like tool. So why do you think people in exec roles are having such a hard time adapting to the way that we currently have to meet?
Well, consider the managers of today. Most of them have probably, moved up the corporate ladder by, managing by walking around. They've been able to see their people and see what they're doing and kind of keep tabs on things that way. In a virtual setting, it's not FaceTime, it's outcomes and output. And that can be harder to measure, even as a manager. So it requires them to completely rethink how they assess an employee's value. So it's hard. It's hard to make that shift in mindset. So it's understandable that they'd say, no, I want my people back. This is the way I've always done things. This is where I feel most comfortable. But I think it's a lost opportunity. So let me give you an example. I was working with a client who was saying that he feels that he knows his new employees better than those that he hired before the pandemic, because he said, throughout the entire hiring process, we had this personal portal into their worlds. He said, I know the names of their children. I've met their pets. He said, and I feel like a deeper connection to these employees than those who I hired when we were all co-located. So there's great value in having this sort of relationship that is built, in this intimate yet separated platform that can't be, undervalued. I mean, there's actually a lot that can be gained from this. So what I would say is you just have to learn how to lead through the lens. You need to understand how to best connect through that camera. The camera is the conduit to your conversation partner. So, treat it as such. So it just requires you to really be thinking about who you're talking to on the other side and trying to reach them by pouring your energy through that camera lens.
One of the other things I've seen people, kind of wrestle with, like people are super personable, have a lot of personality in person, but some people get nervous and they lose like what makes them special when it comes to like talking to the camera, 'cause they feel
Right.
like they're talking to a camera and not necessarily a person.
Yeah.
So what are some things to kind of combat that and then to also give someone like a confidence boost?
Well, I touched on it a little bit, that the camera is the conduit to your conversation partner. And if people don't have that in mind, that's when you see a person who's normally very animated in person look like they've had all their personality sucked out of them because they're not recognizing where their audience is. The audience is not on the screen, even though the faces might be on the screen. It's your audience is not a piece of glass. Your audience is the human being or all of the human beings on the other side of the camera lens who are watching you. And it requires you to really change how you think about that. Your mental mindset is the key to being effective on camera. So whenever I am talking on any webcam, I'm always looking into the camera lens, because I know that to you, Jara, for example, it feels good for me to be looking at the camera lens. It feels like I'm probably looking right at you. I'm making good eye contact, and we all appreciate that. If I go with my natural impulses, I'm going to look at the screen. But when I look at the screen, it creates a disconnect between me and my audience. So in order to speak with impact, you need to look through the camera. But it's not just a matter of saying, okay, I'm going to look at the camera and I'm going to stare at the camera, because then you look like you're being held hostage by the camera lens, right? And that's not natural. You want to interact with the camera as you would with a person face to face. And we break gaze all the time. We don't stare at people because it makes them feel uncomfortable.
Right.
So a quick trick that you can try is take a picture of a family member or a friend and put it beside your webcam, just to remind yourself that there is indeed somebody on the other side. You just can't see them that well. But it really is so imperative that you do that. And you can see a difference for yourself if you record yourself, look at the camera lens, look at the screen, look at the camera lens, look at the screen, and you can tell what a difference it makes if you actually engage with the webcam.
Are leaders that are kind of worried about if their team's really paying attention, like if they're engaged or not, or truly listening virtually. How do you help with that? Or are there any like tips or tricks like Zoom, for instance, you have like the comments, you can raise your hand. Are there instances like that that you encourage people to use those sort of like interaction tools during virtual meetings?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a couple of different things that I would advocate to encourage
Mhm.
participation and kind of keep tabs on who is staying engaged and who is not.
Mhm.
First of all, set the standard at the beginning that you want it to be interactive and you want people to be participatory, and then let them know all the different ways that they can do that. So that can be, by raising your physical hand. It can be by raising your emoji hand. You can put in chat a question or a comment, but it is incumbent upon the leader to check out that chat and attend to it and make sure that whatever comments or questions that are put in there are either answered or brought to the verbal dialogue. So it really requires the leader to be monitoring that, or assign somebody to be the chat monitor who can then raise your attention to the fact that somebody has something to say. And nonverbal participation is a great thing to incorporate into any virtual engagement or any hybrid engagement, because it gives more opportunities for people to have their voices heard. The other thing I would recommend is whenever you are speaking on camera, I mentioned you want to be looking at the camera lens.
Mhm.
I would say primarily looking at the camera lens. That does not mean staring at it. You can glance down, and in less than half a second, I can pick up on the fact that, Jara, you are nodding your head. Those nonverbal cues help me as a presenter to adjust my feedback, right? If you're nodding, I'm like, okay, she's with me, we're good. But if I would look down and you'd be like this and looking to the side, looking like you're completely tuned out, that is also nonverbal feedback that I can use to
Mhm.
recognize, okay, I better change some things up because I'm losing Jara. So it doesn't take you staring at the gallery view of the faces on the screen. You can ascertain whether people are nodding along or nodding off in a split second. So it just requires you, though, to keep that in mind and just take a quick look at what people are doing. So that is really an important tool to be able to use. But participation is critical, because the challenges with these platforms that people have been conditioned to be passive observers of
Mhm.
screens. As we watch TV, we watch movies, but now we want people to be active participants through a screen. So you have to always think about getting people to do stuff. So that can be putting something in chat, that can be raising your hand, that can be, answering a poll. You always want to have these kind of tools of engagement that you use throughout any sort of session, just so that you have people, constantly, doing something related to the meeting itself, because otherwise they'll tune out. So that means if you're doing like an information sharing meeting, which we would say you shouldn't do in the first place, live at least, that if you are doing information sharing, you at least want to figure out ways to get them to do something associated with it. So whether that's, tell me, how comfortable do you feel turning on your webcam? And I'm talking about something else, but they're putting in chat, oh, I feel very comfortable, I never turn it on, whatever it is. You want to get people to constantly be involved,
Mhm.
even if you're the one who's primarily speaking.
We are definitely advocates of, always having like meaningful collaboration and engagement and things like that during like virtual meeting
Yeah,
and
the
work
one
and
thing I'd
things.
mentioned too that I forgot to mention, which is key to all of this, is everybody has to have their camera on. If it's a small enough
Mhm.
meeting that you can all fit on one screen, you need to have your camera on, because it helps the person who's leading the meeting to see how their message is resonating, but it
Mhm.
also helps you as the attendee to hold you accountable. Because if you turn your video off, it'll be way too enticing for you to start multitasking. You're going to open up another tab, you're going to check your
Mhm.
email, you're going to be doing something other than just attending the meeting. And that leads to a less effective meeting overall. And research has found that for every one bad meeting, you have 3 more meetings. And we don't need more meetings. We have enough.
Definitely. So to kind of like wrap this up, what are some general on camera tips to ensure that we all look our best when it comes to like being on camera during a virtual meeting or event?
Excellent. So this is kind of what I would call your personal production value and how you show up whenever you're on webcam. So the first thing you want to think about is what your background is. You want your background to be professional, neutral, and not distracting. So a lot of people like the virtual backgrounds. I say that's great, except just make sure that it layers appropriately. So
Mhm.
you don't want to have those really watery edges where, parts of your hair are eaten by the background, because the artificial intelligence is good, but it's not perfect. So sometimes it
Right.
has a hard time reading where you end and the background
Mhm.
begins. If you're doing just a regular plain background, without a virtual, sort of effect, then just make sure that there's nothing behind you that could pull focus from you. So you want the focus to be on you, the messenger, and not on your bobblehead collection behind you. That's not a good thing. But you can't have like one conversation starter. You just don't want to have 10.
Mhm.
The next thing I would say is think about how you're framing yourself. You want to make sure that you take up as much screen space as possible. So I suggest following the 3-finger rule. So if you take 3 fingers, I think about it as like the Girl Scout salute. You stick it on
Mhm.
top of your head. That's the amount of space you want to have between the top of your head and the top of the frame. Why you want to do this is because when you're talking to somebody face to face, you're not looking at them from head to toe as you're talking to them. No, you're taking in their body language from
Mhm.
about this much space, and you want to give the same sort of canvas that they can read in a virtual setting. And then I would just be mindful of where you have your camera positioned. You want it to be at eye level. So if you're using your webcam on your laptop, you might be tempted just to keep it down on your desk, but then that often looks like you're looking down on your conversation partner. If you have an external webcam, maybe you put it on top of your monitor, but then maybe you're looking up and you're like a little kid asking a parent for permission. So you want to make sure that your webcam is at eye level. You can draw a level line from your eyeballs to your camera lens.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karen. I'm sure this information will be super helpful for many people.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to talk about. Thanks so much.